Hello, everyone, and welcome to Archaea Viking. And guess what? It's Black History Month. So, in honor of Black History Month, I'm going to do two videos on the history of two specific African American cultures within the United States. The subject of today's video is the Gullah-Geechee culture in the Atlantic world, specifically the section of the Atlantic coast that extends from Wilmington, North Carolina, all the way down to Jacksonville, Florida, in what is known as the Gullah-Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor. Okay, so right off the bat, we need to define some terms, specifically the terms Gullah and Geechee and Gullah-Geechee itself. So the term Gullah is a cultural term for African Americans from the Low Countries of North Carolina and South Carolina that likely linguistically derives from the name of the region of West Africa known as Angola. Then the phrase Geechee is a cultural term for African Americans from the Low Country of Georgia and Florida that likely linguistically derives from the shortened name of the Ogeechee River near Savannah, Georgia. And then together, they make the phrase Gullah-Geechee, which is an umbrella term for African Americans within the Low Country of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. And here are my sources where I got this information from. So now we begin, starting with the Gullah-Geechee in the Colonial South. Now, right off the bat, I do want to say that throughout this video, I'm going to be interchanging between the phrase Gullah-Geechee and African American. And there is a reason for that, that has to do with when the term Gullah-Geechee was officially adopted by the African American peoples of the Low Country of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. But that will come up later in the video. So just be forewarned, I am going to interchange throughout the video. Okay, so starting off, African chattel slavery was introduced to the British colonies of North Carolina and South Carolina in 1670 CE. However, despite the introduction of African chattel slavery, Native American chattel slavery remained the dominant slave trade in North and South Carolina between the 1600s to 1717 CE. However, this would change when the Tuscarora War and the subsequent Yamasee War would break out in response to the Native American slave trade, with both wars resulting in the defeat of the Tuscarora Nation and the Yamasee Nation by the British Empire. After the Tuscarora and Yamasee Wars, Native American slavery would be gradually replaced by the chattel slavery of Africans, with the British Empire beginning to import 1,000 enslaved Africans annually from the regions of Africa such as Angola, Senegambia, the Windward Coast, the Gold Coast, Sierra Leone, the Bight of Benin, and the Bight of Biafra, Madagascar, and Mozambique. And they would do this between 1717 and 1739 CE. Facilitating this importation of enslaved Africans was a company known as the Royal African Company of the British Empire, which used fortresses off the coast of West Africa, such as Cape Coast Castle, um, and which is off the coast of what is now Guinea, and the fortress of Bunce Island, which is off the coast of what is now Sierra Leone. And these fortresses would be used to conduct raiding and trading expeditions to obtain enslaved Africans. Many of these enslaved individuals were professional soldiers from powerful African kingdoms who had been captured by rival African kingdoms or by British raids. And the Royal African Company would conduct these raids and these trading expeditions between 1670 and 1807 CE. And here's just a broader map of the transatlantic slave trade, and you can see sort of the numbers of enslaved enslaved Africans who were forcibly imported from Africa to the Americas, and also, as you can see here, a little bit into Asia and Europe as well. And they would be packed uh, densely um, into these ships, were making it very cramped, unsanitary conditions where they would be chained down and unable to move, um, basically for most of the trip. And here's another depiction of that here. And here's another depiction of the transatlantic slave trade here. Eventually, the colony of Georgia would be founded by James Oglethorpe as a colony that would ban African chattel slavery. And he would found this colony in 1732 CE. And I already have a video on Oglethorpe's founding of this colony uh, to ban slavery, which I will include in the iCard. Um, and then while this is happening, by 1739 CE, the colony of South Carolina would begin to have an African majority. Uh, and because of this, many enslaved Africans would run away and often flee to Spanish Florida to join the Spanish army. Therefore, in the eyes of many of the trustees who founded the colony of Georgia alongside James Oglethorpe, legalizing African chattel slavery in Georgia would potentially provide reinforcements to Spain, whom the British Empire was at war with at the time. As a result of this growing African majority in South Carolina, as well as the promise of freedom in Spanish Florida, soldiers from the West African Kingdom of Congo who had been enslaved would ignite the Stoner Rebellion. These enslaved soldiers would make for freedom in Spanish Florida, but would be defeated by colonial forces in 1739 CE. I've already done an in-depth video on the Stoner Rebellion that I will link in the iCard. After the Stono Rebellion, the colonial government of South Carolina would enact harsher slave codes. These codes would state that enslaved Africans and African Americans were not allowed to learn to read or write, to make their own money, grow their own food, or assemble in groups. Enslavers were required to provide enslaved Africans and African Americans with adequate food and clothing and could not work them on the Sabbath or murder them, though the latter statement for enslavers was often ignored, and the sale of alcohol to enslaved Africans and African Americans was prohibited, and a moratorium was imposed on the importation of enslaved Africans. Then, by the mid 1740s, despite the ban of African chattel slavery, many wealthy lowland Scots who had settled in both Georgia and South Carolina would actively defy the ban by establishing rice plantations in Augusta, Georgia, near the South Carolina-Georgia border. Then by January 1st, 1751 CE, despite the best attempts of Oglethorpe and his allies, continued campaigns by a group of wealthy Georgia colonists known as the Malcontents, wealthy South Carolina plantation owners, and ministers who supported African chattel slavery, the trustees would eventually cave to all these individuals and legalize the institution, the trustees being the individuals who helped Oglethorpe found the colony of Georgia. After the legalization of African chattel slavery in the colony of Georgia, plantations in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia would begin to be built around the production of rice and indigo. And here's a picture of a rice plantation here. And this is an indigo processing section of an indigo plantation. And as I always like to point out, African chattel slavery was very much an incredibly brutal institution, with individuals being punished severely for any minor infraction, with punishments including being beat with paddles that may have spikes on them or holes in them, as well as the more well-known whipping, also known as lashing, which itself could leave horrific scars. And oftentimes, uh, white enslavers would force other enslaved Africans and African Americans to do the lashing uh, for them as a way to sort of maintain power and a sense of helplessness. Uh, Also, white enslavers would more often than not sell apart entire families of enslaved Africans and African Americans, as you can see in this picture, and in this picture, selling away spouses and even children from their parents. Uh, then, also during this time period, ministers would begin to use biblical verses to instill support of slavery and ideals of supposed white superiority to Africans and African Americans, which would be used as tools to maintain support for African chattel slavery from poor white settlers. And as I am sure surprises no one, the brutality of African chattel slavery would lead many enslaved Africans and African Americans to continue fleeing plantations in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia for freedom within Native American communities, such as the Seminole Nation, where they were treated as equals and often would intermarry with these Native American nations and communities, as well as fleeing to Spanish Florida, where again they would be given their freedom in return for military service. After its initial adoption of African chattel slavery, the colony of Georgia has insufficient funds to import enslaved Africans directly from Africa. So instead, the colony would begin importing enslaved Africans from British colonies in the Caribbean, such as Jamaica. You can see that here and here. And they would do this between 1751, well into the 1790s CE. Uh, then between 1758 and 1761 CE, the continued flight of enslaved Africans and African Americans to Native American nations, such as the Cherokee during the Anglo-Cherokee War, would lead many South Carolina colonists to fear the outbreak of another rebellion similar to the Stoner Rebellion, and these fears would play a large part in South Carolina's decision to join the American Revolution against the British Empire. It wouldn't be the only reason they joined, but it would definitely be a major factor. And I've already done an in-depth video on the Anglo-Cherokee War that I will include in the iCard. Then in 1776 CE, the American Revolution will begin between the 13 British colonies and the British Empire. During the American Revolution, seeking freedom as a result of proclamations by British officers promising freedom for enslaved Africans who would fight against the colonists, such as Dunmore's proclamation, enslaved African men and women would flock to ports recently captured by the British Army, such as Charleston and Savannah, to join the British Army. With many of these migrations and flights to Charleston and Savannah happening between 1775 and 1776 CE. Enslaved African American men in South Carolina and Georgia would then fight for their freedom in the British Army, while enslaved African and African American women would provide key services to the British Army, such as feeding soldiers and providing medical care. Though, as I'm sure most people watching this video are aware, eventually, with the help of the French Empire as well as allied Native American nations, the 13 colonies would win the American Revolution and eventually create the United States of America. Though they would not create it right away, but that's a subject for a different video. And this would all happen between 1782 and 1789 CE. After the American Revolution, roughly 5,300 free and formerly enslaved Africans and African Americans would be evacuated from South Carolina, and roughly 3,500 free and formerly enslaved African Americans would be evacuated from Georgia alone. Again, this is just from those two colonies. and they would be evacuated by the British to British colonies such as Jamaica and Nova Scotia, granting them freedom, with this happening between 1782 and 1783 CE. Now this brings us to our next section, the Gullah-Geechee in the United States and the antebellum South. So, immediately after the American Revolution, the leaders of the American Revolution, such as Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, would refuse to abolish African chattel slavery in the United States, leaving South Carolina and Georgia, both seen here on the right, um, slave states until after the American Civil War, with this happening between 1782 and 1865 CE. Then in 1793 CE, the cotton gin would be invented in Georgia, making it easier to process large amounts of cotton. This would then lead to the gradual rise of cotton as the main cash crop of the southern United States. The increase in cotton production would lead to the flourishing of Georgia's economy. This would allow Georgia to begin importing enslaved Africans directly from Africa. Uh, in 1803, a shipload of captive West Africans, including a number of the Igbo people from what is now Nigeria, would be landed in Savannah by a slave ship to be auctioned off at one of the local slave markets. However, under the direction of a high Igbo chief among them, the group would walk in unison into the creek, singing in the Igbo language. The water spirit brought us, the water spirit will take us home, thereby accepting the protection of their deity, Chukwu, and accepting death over the alternative of enslavement, which was actually a very common thing because African chattel slavery was such a horrible institution. This event would become known as the Igbo Landing slave escape and mass suicide. And again, this would happen in 1803 CE. And here is one of the markers left specifically on St. Simon's Island where this event happened. Then, between 1791 and 1809 CE, enslaved Africans would initiate a rebellion against the French Empire in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, uh, eventually defeating the French Empire and establishing the Republic of Haiti. As a result, thousands of white French enslavers and their enslaved Africans would flee the colony, eventually making their way to southern ports such as Charleston and Savannah. And you can see the rebellion here and the flight of white French enslavers here. The United States then, in 1808 CE, would officially ban the importation of enslaved Africans and would cease the transatlantic slave trade. However, the United States did not stop the domestic slave trade, and also many merchants would outright ignore the ban on the transatlantic slave trade. Then in 1812 CE, the United States would go to war against the British Empire in the War of 1812 CE. Similar to the American Revolution, enslaved Africans and African Americans would fight for their freedom against the United States during the War of 1812 CE, with formerly enslaved African soldiers even invading Georgia itself during the conflict. By the way, I've already done an in-depth video on the War of 1812 that I will link in the iCard. After the War of 1812 CE, runaway enslaved Africans and African Americans in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia would continue to flee to Spanish Florida to gain freedom in the Seminole Nation, as well as freedom in the Spanish Empire in return for military service. And this would actually be one of the causes of an invasion of Spanish Florida by the United States, led by Andrew Jackson. It wouldn't be the only cause, but it would definitely be a key cause. And here is a map of that invasion by Andrew Jackson here. The intense heat of the southern Atlantic coast, as well as the prevalence of tropical diseases such as malaria, would often lead white American enslavers along the North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida coast to leave their estates in the summer for estates in the mainland. In the process, they would leave their enslaved Africans and African Americans in the care of only the white overseers. This would allow enslaved Africans and African Americans to preserve much of their traditional practices from Africa by syncretizing them with Christian and Native American practices. And all of this would happen in what is known as the antebellum period of the South, which would last roughly between uh, the 1820s to the 1860s CE, and a little bit earlier, you could argue right at the end of the War of 1812 CE to the 1860s. In contrast to much of the South, the enslaved Africans and African Americans in the low country of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida uh, based their work around individual tasks rather than gang work. Uh, Gang work being, like, say, working in gangs within cotton fields or rice fields. This would provide in the enslaved Africans and African Americans in the low country of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida slightly more freedom, though, of course, they still faced brutal treatment at the hands of white American enslavers. The larger degree of freedom compared to enslaved Africans and African Americans further inland allowed many enslaved Africans and African Americans in the low country of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida to flee to freedom on the Underground Railroad, seeking freedom in Mexico, Canada, and the Caribbean. All right, now this brings us to our next section, the culture of the Gullah-Geechee peoples, starting with Gullah-Geechee food. So Gullah-Geechee food is made up of traditional West African foods, many of which are actually now staples of Southern food in the modern era. These include Sea Island red peas and Sea Island red okra, Carolina gold rice, and watermelon. Gullah-Geechee food also incorporates seafood such as shrimp and items made from pork such as sausage, as well as plants native to the Americas such as blackberries and peanuts. Foods such as gumbo incorporate all of these items, of course, with the exception of blackberries. Similar to the types of food that the Gullah-Geechee use, the Gullah-Geechee mortar and pestles also bear similarities to traditional West African mortar and pestles, suggesting a very similar cultural continuation to the types of food that they use as well. Then we come to Gullah-Geechee art, which includes things such as Gullah-Geechee quilts, which mimic the design of cloth woven with the traditional strip loom used throughout West Africa, with kente cloth from the Ashanti and Yu peoples, and equete cloth from the Igbo people, both using both being woven on the strip loom and bearing similarities to Gullah-Geechee strip quilts. And I do apologize. I'm sure I butchered the names of these cultural groups, and I apologize. The Gullah-Geechee people also weave baskets out of sweetgrass that are nearly identical to the baskets made by the Wolof people of Senegal. The Gullah-Geechee people also produce unique face jugs, with many of these face jugs being specifically attributed to a small number of enslaved African Americans working as potters in the Edgefield district of South Carolina. These are hypothesized to have either religious slash burial significance, or to reflect complex responses of people attempting to live and maintain their personal identities under harsh conditions, or represent both. They have both of these significances. And here are some more examples. Here, And you can look at these examples again here. And then this brings us to the religion of the Gullah-Geechee people. So initially, many of the imported enslaved Africans were either Muslim or polytheistic. But eventually, many of the imported enslaved Africans, especially those from the Kingdom of Congo, would also be Catholic Christian. And then gradually, the enslaved and free African Americans who were not Christian would convert to Christianity, with small churches being built on islands such as Sapelo and St. Simon's Island. That being said, the preservation of traditional West African religious practices is seen in the use of pierced coin amulets to protect from curses and conjuration, and in caches consisting of items such as pins and crab claws, which may be connected to religious practices such as conjuration and divination. Though, admittedly, as many archaeologists who specialize in this subfield of archaeology point out, we may be imposing modern Gullah-Geechee practices onto modern Gullah-Geechee religious practices onto caches that we have no real context for other than where they are located. Also, traditional folkloric and spiritual practices of the Gullah-Geechee and West African spiritual beliefs can be seen in the Gullah-Geechee use of haint blue paint to ward off evil spirits and witches, such as haints. And in fact, this practice has since been adopted by white Americans in the South as well, and actually can be found as far north as the Appalachian Mountains, in northwest Georgia, North Carolina, East Tennessee, uh, Kentucky, etc. Another continuation of a possible continuation of West African spiritual and religious beliefs can be seen in the Igbo landing, slave escape, and mass suicide, which would become associated with the flying Africans folktale present in the folklore of African Americans and Afro Caribbeans. Now, this brings us to our next section, the Gullah-Geechee in the era of the American Civil War. So, by the 1850s, Savannah, Georgia's population would grow rapidly, with the free and enslaved African American population roughly reaching between 6,000 to 8,000 individuals. As Savannah's population would grow, free and enslaved African Americans would contribute heavily to the city's economy. They would work and earn wages as mill workers, skilled craftsmen, and delivery workers. This would allow them to create independent and often secret churches and volunteer associations. Then, in 1858 CE, 50 years after the importation of enslaved Africans from Africa to the United States was prohibited, the ship known as the Wanderer would land on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia with 465 enslaved Africans. This would be the next to last successful shipment of enslaved Africans to the United States from Africa, with the last successful ship to import enslaved Africans being the ship known as the Clotilda, which actually imported enslaved Africans to Alabama. Then South Carolina would secede from the United States to defend the institution of African chattel slavery on December 20th, 1860 CE. Florida would follow on January 10th, 1861 CE. Georgia would follow on January 19th, 1861 CE. And North Carolina would follow in February of 1861 CE. All states would join the newly created Confederate States of America, also known as the Confederacy. Then, on April 12th and April 13th, 1861 CE, the Confederacy would attack the United States Fort Sumter, officially beginning the American Civil War. The United States Navy would then quickly blockade southern port cities such as Charleston and Savannah, among others, as part of General Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan, which you can see here. As the United States Navy would blockade the southern ports, many white enslavers would flee inland. In the process, they would abandon their plantations and enslaved African Americans. In Confederate-controlled cities such as Savannah, free African Americans would respond to cash incentives, working in war-related industries such as sawmills and the railroad industry, doing this between 1861 and into 1865 CE. Then, on April 13th, 1862 CE, after capturing Fort Pulaski, United States General David Hunter would issue General Orders Number 7, emancipating enslaved African Americans in Georgia, South Carolina, and Alabama. Though the general order would be eventually rescinded by President Abraham Lincoln, however, the general orders would serve as a precursor to Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. With the arrival of the United States Navy, the enslaved African Americans of the North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida Lowcountry would be eager for emancipation, with many joining the United States Army's 1st South Carolina Volunteer Infantry Regiment, which served between 1862 and 1865 CE. In addition to this, Robert Smalls would lead his family and other enslaved African Americans to steal a Confederate warship, successfully leading the ship to the United States forces. Smalls would then go on to become a ship captain in the United States Navy and would become a war hero. I've already done an in-depth video on Robert Smalls' life that I will include in the iCard. Then between 1862 and 1865 CE, United States General Ormsby M. Mitchell would found the city of Mitchellville, initiating what becomes known as the Port Royal experiment, where formerly enslaved African Americans would found thriving communities and successfully work abandoned plantations. During this time, many Northern teachers, such as William Francis Allen, would arrive to establish schools within these communities. And here's a picture of Mitchellville here. At the same time, Unitarian missionaries from Pennsylvania would travel to the North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida Lowcountry to start schools for the newly freed African Americans, such as the Penn School on St. Helena Island, South Carolina. Then, between November 15th and December 21st, 1864 CE, United States General William Tecumseh Sherman would invade Georgia, destroying the industry, infrastructure, and civilian property of Georgia, disrupting the Confederacy's economy and transportation networks. Sherman's force would eventually capture Savannah, Georgia, with this event becoming known as Sherman's March to the Sea. After the March to the Sea, Sherman would order for African American refugees to be resettled on 400,000 acres of land, promising 40 acres and a mule to each family in what becomes known as Special Field Orders Number 15, with this special field orders being specifically given on January 16th, 1865 CE. Then, in April 9th, of 1865 CE, the American Civil War would officially end with the surrender of Confederate General Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse. Now this brings us to our next section, the Gullah-Geechee in the Reconstruction and Jim Crow eras. So immediately after, or shortly after the end of the American Civil War, on September 12th, 1865, President Andrew Johnson would rescind Sherman's general order and ordered the restoration of Southern lands to white American enslavers. Despite Johnson's orders, United States General Rufus Saxton would ignore the orders and would allow emancipated African Americans to continue establishing thriving communities on islands such as Ossabaw Island near Savannah, Georgia. In response to this, Johnson would replace Saxton with United States General Tilson, who would begin to restore lands to white American enslavers. Then, in March of 1865, the Freedmen's Bureau would be established and would begin to combat Johnson's policies. However, despite the best efforts of the Freedmen's Bureau, many prominent African Americans would begin to flee their homes on islands such as Ossabaw Island and Sapelo Island. Some, such as Tunis Campbell, would establish new communities in towns such as Darien, Georgia, in 1866 CE. At the same time that these flights were happening, the African Americans would be granted the right to vote in the Civil Rights Act of 1866 CE. Then in 1867 CE, Congress would overturn Johnson's decisions and would initiate the military reconstruction of the South. And I have an in-depth video on Reconstruction that I will include in the iCard if possible. During military Reconstruction, many African Americans in the North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida Lowcountry would actually be able to regain much of the land lost to Johnson's policies. Though not everything would be a happy ending, uh, because the Ku Klux Klan would form and would begin to terrorize African American communities in the South. This would lead to individuals such as Tunis Campbell to form African American militias to protect themselves. And these events would happen between 1865 and the 1870s CE. And here is an early form of the Ku Klux Klan. And here is a African American militia. As you can see on the date here, this is a little bit too late for this time period, but this is generally something that how one of those militias might have looked. Then Tunis Campbell would be elected to the Georgia State Senate in 1868 CE, only to be expelled from office because a majority of white Georgia legislators agreed that even though African Americans had the right to vote, the Georgia Constitution prohibited them from holding office. Campbell, however, was able to return to office in 1871 CE, but would lose a bid for re-election in 1872 CE. During his time as a state senator, Campbell would serve on the Senate's Petitions and General Education Committees. After his time as a senator, Campbell would work as a justice of the peace, which would enrage former white enslavers as he was an African American with authority over white Americans. And all of this would happen between 1868 and 1876 CE. While Tunis Campbell was being elected to the Georgia uh, state senate, several prominent African Americans from the South Carolina Lowcountry, such as Robert Smalls and Joseph Rainey, would become members of both the South Carolina and the United States House of Representatives between 1868 and the 1880s CE. And this would, of course, ring true for North Carolina and Florida. However, due to being constrained by time, I can only mention a few individuals. Then the Civil Rights Act of 1875 CE would be passed by the United States Senate. The act would guarantee that everyone, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, was entitled to the same treatment in public accommodations such as inns, public transportation, theaters, and other places of recreation. However, the act had little effect in practice, with the act being specifically passed on March 1st, 1875 CE. Then, between 1871 and 1877 CE, a group of Southern Democrats known as the Redeemers and the Bourbon Triumvirate would lead Southern Democrats to eventually retake the Senate and the House of Representatives, and would eventually end Reconstruction in the South. Then the Southern Democrats would try and convict Tunis Campbell of malfeasance in office. Campbell would be sentenced to 1 year at a convict labor camp in 1876 CE. Upon release, Campbell would move his family north. And here is a picture of what one of those labor camps would have looked like. Then In 1883 CE, the Supreme Court would declare much of the Civil Rights Act of 1875 CE unconstitutional. And then just 13 years after that, the Supreme Court would rule that segregation of white Americans and other minority groups, including African Americans, is legal, what was legal in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. This would officially begin the Jim Crow South. In the Jim Crow South, African Americans and other minority groups would be segregated, with schools, bathrooms, and buses, among other places, being separated by race. The facilities used by minority groups were usually underfunded and dilapidated. In addition to this, while minority groups had the right to vote, minority groups would often be blocked from voting through intimidation and the use and other methods such as poll taxes. In the low country of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, wealthy white Americans would buy land traditionally belonging to African Americans, such as John Eugene Dumignon, who would build the Jekyll Island Club on Jekyll Island, and Howard E. Coffin, who would build a resort for wealthy white Americans on Sapelo Island. These resorts would lead African Americans to face further mistreatment and disenfranchisement, with these resorts operating and being built between 1886 and 1907 CE. The inequalities of the Jim Crow South would lead many minority groups, including African Americans from the Low Country of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, to begin to move to northern states where society was slightly more equal. This event would become known as the First Great Migration, and it would occur between roughly 1910 to 1940 CE, though, as this map shows here, some argue it's 1916 is when it began. The first Great Migration would then lead to many African Americans from the Low Country of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida to found new communities in northern cities such as Harlem and Queens in New York City. Then, in October of 1929 CE, the United States stock market would crash, leading to an economic downturn known as the Great Depression, which would last roughly between October 1929 CE to sometime in 1939 CE. And I say that obviously because finding a definitive end to an event like this is nearly impossible. As a result of the Great Depression would eventually lead to resorts in the Low Country of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida to close down, such as the Jekyll Island Club and Coffin's Resort. At the same time this was all happening, specifically between the 1920s and 1940s CE, Northern writers, both white Americans and African Americans, such as Julia Perkins and W.E.B. Du Bois, would begin to study the African Americans of the North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida Lowcountry, where they were specifically looking for continuations of traditional West African cultural practices. However, these writers would begin to paint the African Americans of the North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida Lowcountry as backward and primitive. Even African American writers, such as Du Bois, would fall prey to these stereotypes, albeit in a much more sympathetic light, viewing these groups as the inheritors of the true African culture, or at least viewing them as culturally closer to Africa than, say, African Americans living in Harlem, New York. Then, between 1929 and 1949 CE, Lorenzo D. Turner would conduct research to determine the linguistic and cultural origins of the African Americans of the North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida Lowcountry. Unlike his predecessors, Turner did not rely on stereotypes and would develop strategies to avoid biases commonly found in the research of other researchers. In fact, it was Turner who first connected the African Americans of the North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida Lowcountry linguistically and culturally to West African regions such as Angola. And he would write all of that down in his thesis titled Africanisms in the Gullah Dialect. Then, after World War II, specifically between 1945 and 1970 CE, a second, much larger wave of African Americans would begin to migrate to the northern states and the West Coast in what becomes known as the Second Great Migration. Then, on May 17th, 1954 CE, the Supreme Court would declare the racial segregation of public schools unconstitutional in the case of Brown v. the Board of Education. However, racial segregation as a whole did not end. Uh, this would also be the time that the civil rights movement would begin. During the civil rights movement, prominent African Americans from the low country of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, such as Septima Poinsetta Clark, would work as activists and educators, while their songs, traditionally used for religious worship, would be used as tools of protest. Then, on August 6, 1965 CE, President Lyndon B. Johnson would sign the Voting Rights Act of 1965 into law. Uh, and then on April 11th, 1968 CE, President Lyndon B. Johnson would sign the Equal Rights Act of 1968 CE into law, officially ending the Jim Crow era. However, it is important to note that while the Jim Crow era has officially ended, the effects of the Jim Crow era are still very much felt in the modern era. Now, this brings us to our last section, the Gullah-Geechee in the post-Jim Crow South. So, in the post Jim Crow South, individuals of the Gullah-Geechee people would begin exploring and expressing their history. For example, Sam Doyle would paint the history of the African Americans of the North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia and Florida Lowcountry. And with him making these paintings of their history between 1968 and 1985 CE. In fact, here is an example of one of those paintings here, and you can see other examples behind him in this picture here. Then between the 1980s and 1990s CE, African American writers such as Toni Morrison, Gloria Naylor, and Paul Marshall would reignite interest in the culture and history of the African Americans of the North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida Lowcountry. Uh, and also, this may be pronounced Paula. If that's the case, I do apologize. And then also between the 1980s and 1990s, the African Americans of the North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida Lowcountry would adopt and remake the terms Gullah and Geechee, which were words originally used as derogatory terms for the African Americans of this region. And they would shift it, remake it, and would turn it into their cultural names. And there is the explanation as to why I interchanged between Gullah-Geechee and African American. Then in January 1991 CE, prominent Gullah-Geechee activist Julie Dash would create the film Daughters of the Dust, which was a fictionalized telling of her father's life on the coast of South Carolina and Georgia in 1902 CE. And starting from the 1980s into the present, the Gullah-Geechee would hold festivals and still hold festivals to share and educate the public on their culture and history. Then on October 12th, 2006 CE, the Gullah-Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor would be created by Congress. However, it was not created until the Gullah-Geechee were able to negotiate key restrictions and regulations to make sure tourists did not disrespect their communities and still don't disrespect their communities, and so that tourists who purchased and still purchase property on islands such as Sapelo Island uh, obeyed and still obey all pre-existing zoning laws. Now, of course, as anyone knows, that's what it says on paper. Unfortunately, uh, people are really good about finding loopholes around zoning laws. But that at least the negotiations happened. And then finally, there are many prominent African Americans of Gullah-Geechee heritage, which include but are not limited to Marquette Goodwine, also known as Queen Ket, chiefess of the Gullah-Geechee Nation. Uh, there's also Michelle Obama and Chris Rock, among many others. All right, with that, that ends our first video for this year's Black History Month. I hope you enjoyed learning about the history of the Gullah-Geechee peoples of the North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida Lowcountry. If you'd like me to cover any of the subjects that I talked about in this video in greater detail in later videos, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. And remember to like, share, and subscribe. And I hope you all have a good day.